Get on the ground now. The command cut through the afternoon silence like a blade. Officer Kyle Morrison's voice carried the full authority of his badge and the weight of 12 years patrolling the suburban streets of Millfield, Georgia. His service weapon was drawn, pointed directly at the woman standing beside the black Mercedes sedan. The woman didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her hands visible, her posture erect despite the gun aimed at her chest. Colonel Denise Franklin wore her dress blue uniform, the ribbons and insignia catching the late afternoon sunlight. 3 silver oak leaves gleamed on her shoulders. 24 years of military service had taught her to remain calm under pressure. But this was different. "Officer, I'm reaching for my identification," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Her movements were deliberate, careful, as she began to reach toward her uniform pocket. "Don't move!" Morrison shouted, his weapon steady in a two-handed grip. "Keep your hands where I can see them!" The traffic stop had begun routinely enough. Colonel Franklin had been driving through Millfield on her way to Fort Benning, just 40 minutes away, where she served as the deputy commander of the Armor School. She'd pulled into a gas station to fill up and grab a coffee when Officer Morrison's patrol car had suddenly appeared behind her, lights flashing. Now, 5 minutes later, she found herself in a situation that defied comprehension. Morrison had approached her vehicle with his hand on his weapon, immediately demanding she step out of the car. No explanation, no indication of what traffic violation she might have committed, just commands barked with increasing aggression. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" she had asked through her partially opened window, keeping her hands on the steering wheel as she'd been trained in countless military briefings about civilian police encounters. "License and registration now," Morrison had demanded, his eyes scanning her uniform with what appeared to be suspicion rather than respect. Colonel Franklin had complied, slowly reaching for her military identification and vehicle registration. But as she handed the documents through the window, Morrison had stepped back suddenly. "Get out of the vehicle, now!" The escalation had been swift and inexplicable. Within moments, she was standing beside her car, hands raised, facing down the barrel of a police officer's weapon. Sandra Davis had been pumping gas at the adjacent station when the scene unfolded. At 62, she'd seen her share of police interactions in Millfield, but nothing like this. The woman in the military uniform was clearly complying with every instruction, yet the officer seemed increasingly agitated. Sandra pulled out her phone and started recording. "This is happening right now at the Shell station on Maple Street," she whispered into her phone, live streaming to Facebook. "Police officer has a gun pointed at what looks like a military officer. She's in full uniform." The stream caught the attention of her followers immediately. Comments began flooding in. "Is that an Army uniform? Why is he pointing a gun at a soldier? Someone call the news." Kevin Jackson was inside the gas station convenience store when he heard the shouting. The 18-year-old college student at nearby Columbus State University stepped outside and immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. He started recording with his phone, uploading simultaneously to TikTok and Instagram. "Y'all seeing this?" he said into his phone. "Cop got his gun on a lady in Army uniform. This ain't right." Within minutes, both social media feeds were gaining traction. The hashtags #Millfield Police and Army Officer began trending locally. Back at the scene, Colonel Franklin remained motionless, her military training overriding every instinct to demand an explanation. She understood that any sudden movement could escalate the situation beyond control. "Officer Morrison," she said, reading his nameplate, "I'm a United States Army colonel. My identification is in my uniform pocket. May I retrieve it?" Morrison's face flushed red. "I don't care what you claim to be. You were acting suspicious, looking around like you were planning something." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Colonel Franklin had been doing nothing more than checking her phone for directions to the base, the same thing thousands of drivers did every day. "I was checking GPS directions to Fort Benning," she explained calmly. "I'm stationed there." "Yeah, right," Morrison scoffed. "Stolen valor is a crime, lady. Real military officers don't drive cars like this through neighborhoods like this." The statement revealed everything. Colonel Franklin drove a Mercedes because she could afford it, earned through 2 decades of military service and smart financial planning. But to Officer Morrison, her presence in an upscale vehicle in a predominantly white suburb could only be explained by criminal activity or deception. Ashley Parker pulled into the gas station just as Morrison's backup arrived. Captain James Miller stepped out of his patrol car, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. At 45, Miller had been with the Millfield Police Department for 18 years and had never drawn his weapon during a routine traffic stop. "What's the situation, Kyle?" Miller asked, keeping his own weapon holstered. "Suspicious person," Morrison replied without lowering his gun. "Claims to be military, but look at her. Does she look military to you?" Miller looked at Colonel Franklin, taking in the perfectly pressed uniform, the precise positioning of ribbons and insignia, the professional bearing that was unmistakable to anyone familiar with military personnel. "Kyle," Miller said quietly, "that's a real uniform. Those are real decorations. Anyone can buy this stuff online," Morrison insisted. "She's probably running some kind of scam." Ashley Parker had her phone out now, recording the interaction while staying in her car. At 28, she worked as a paralegal and understood the legal implications of what she was witnessing. Her Instagram live stream was already drawing viewers. "This is absolutely insane," she spoke into her phone. "There's a police officer with his gun drawn on what is clearly a military officer. She's done nothing but stand there and try to comply." The live stream comments were becoming more urgent. "Someone needs to call the base. Get the media involved. This is going to be national news." Colonel Franklin checked her watch, a habit ingrained through years of military precision. The encounter had been ongoing for 8 minutes. In 8 minutes, she could have provided identification, explained her presence, and been on her way to Fort Benning for her evening briefing. Instead, she stood motionless while Officer Morrison continued to point his weapon at her chest. "Officer," she said, maintaining her calm demeanor, "I'm going to be late for a military briefing. Could we please resolve this situation quickly?" Morrison's expression darkened further. "You'll be late for whatever I say you'll be late for. Right now, you're under investigation for suspicious activity and possible stolen valor." The irony wasn't lost on Colonel Franklin. She had served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, commanded a battalion of 400 soldiers, and earned the Bronze Star Medal for valor under enemy fire. Now she stood in a Georgia gas station being accused of faking her military service by a police officer who had likely never left his hometown. Captain Miller stepped closer to Morrison, concern evident in his voice. "Kyle, we need to de-escalate this situation. Let's get her identification and sort this out properly." "I'm handling this, Captain," Morrison replied tersely, not taking his eyes off Colonel Franklin. "This whole thing stinks. Military officers don't act like this." "Like what exactly?" Miller asked. Morrison struggled to articulate his suspicion. "Just suspicious. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong car." The racial subtext was becoming impossible to ignore. Colonel Franklin was a black woman in an expensive car in a predominantly white suburb. To Officer Morrison, that combination could only equal criminal activity. Sandra Davis continued streaming, her viewer count climbing past 200. Her commentary was being shared across multiple Facebook groups. "This is disgusting," she said into her phone. "This woman is clearly military, clearly not doing anything wrong, and this officer has had his gun pointed at her for almost 10 minutes. Kevin Jackson's TikTok video had been shared over 500 times in the past 5 minutes. His followers were tagging news outlets, civil rights organizations, and military advocacy groups. "This needs to go viral," he said into his phone. "People need to see how our military personnel are being treated." Inside the gas station, store clerk Robert Stevens had called 911 to request a supervisor. At 19, he'd never seen a police officer draw a weapon during what appeared to be a routine traffic stop. "I need a supervisor at the Shell station on Maple Street," he told the dispatcher. "There's an officer with his gun drawn on what looks like a military person, and it doesn't seem right." The dispatcher, Maria Gonzalez, had been monitoring the radio traffic. She was aware that Morrison and Miller were handling a suspicious person call, but this was the first indication that weapons were involved. "Is anyone in immediate danger?" she asked. "No, ma'am, but this lady in the Army uniform, she's just standing there with her hands up and the officer won't put his gun away." Maria made a note to contact Sergeant Lisa Johnson, the shift supervisor, immediately. Back at the scene, Colonel Franklin had identified at least 6 civilians recording the encounter. Social media was undoubtedly exploding with videos and commentary. The situation was no longer just a police matter. It was becoming a public relations crisis for both the Millfield Police Department and potentially the United States Army. "Officer Morrison," she said, her tone still professional despite the circumstances, "I understand you're doing your job. However, I need you to understand that I am a senior military officer, and this incident is being recorded by multiple civilians. Perhaps we could resolve this more quietly." Morrison's face reddened further. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all," Colonel Franklin replied. "I'm suggesting that we both have reputations and careers to consider." "My career is just fine," Morrison snapped. "I've been protecting this community for 12 years. "And I've been serving my country for 24 years, Colonel Franklin responded. "I'm not your enemy, officer. I'm on the same side." Captain Miller checked his radio, noting that Sergeant Johnson was en route. He hoped her arrival would bring some sanity to the situation. "Kyle," he said quietly, "the sergeant's coming. Maybe we should get this sorted before she arrives." Morrison's grip on his weapon hadn't wavered. "I'm not backing down from this. Something's not right here." Ashley Parker's Instagram live stream had drawn over 300 viewers. The comments were increasingly outraged. "This is racial profiling in real time. Someone get this to the news immediately. That officer should be fired. How is this happening in 2025? Colonel Franklin maintained her position, hands visible, posture erect. Military bearing was something that couldn't be faked, and anyone with experience around military personnel would recognize it immediately. But Officer Morrison either didn't recognize it or didn't care. The standoff continued, weapons drawn, cameras rolling, and social media exploding with outrage. What had started as a routine traffic stop was becoming a defining moment for everyone involved. And Colonel Franklin knew that the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of this encounter, but potentially the future of Officer Morrison's career, her own reputation, and the relationship between the Millfield Police Department and the military community they were sworn to protect. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gas station as the confrontation entered its 10th minute. Neither participant could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to change. Sergeant Lisa Johnson's patrol car pulled into the Shell station at 3:47 p.m., emergency lights cutting through the afternoon haze. At 38, Johnson had seen enough police encounters gone wrong to recognize a potential disaster from 50 yards away. Officer Morrison had his service weapon drawn on what appeared to be a military officer in dress uniform, while at least 8 civilians recorded everything with their smartphones. "This is Sergeant Johnson arriving at the Shell station on Maple Street," she radioed to dispatch. "I have an officer with weapon drawn, requesting additional backup and a supervisor." Johnson approached carefully, noting the perfect military bearing of the woman standing beside the Mercedes. 20 years of police work had taught her to read people quickly, and everything about this woman screamed legitimate military officer. The uniform was pristine, the ribbons properly aligned, the posture unmistakably professional. "Morrison, what's your situation?" Johnson asked, keeping her own weapon holstered. "Suspicious activity, Sergeant," Morrison replied without lowering his gun. "Subject claims to be military, but behavior doesn't match. Possible stolen valor situation." Johnson looked more closely at Colonel Franklin, noting the silver oak leaves, the combat ribbons, the expert marksmanship badges. This wasn't someone playing dress-up. This was the real thing. "Ma'am," Johnson addressed Colonel Franklin directly, "I'm Sergeant Johnson. What's your name and unit?" "Colonel Denise Franklin, Deputy Commander, U.S. Army Armor School, Fort Benning," Colonel Franklin replied. her voice steady despite having a weapon pointed at her for over 10 minutes. Johnson's eyes widened slightly. Fort Benning was less than an hour away, and she was familiar with the base through various community relations programs. A deputy commander was a significant position, typically held by a full colonel with extensive experience. "Officer Morrison," Johnson said firmly, "please lower your weapon." "Sergeant, I don't think that's advisable," Morrison protested. "This whole situation feels wrong." Sandra Davis continued her Facebook livestream, which had now drawn over 400 viewers. Her commentary was being shared across dozens of community groups throughout Georgia. "The supervisor just arrived," she narrated into her phone. "Maybe now someone with sense can sort this out. This poor woman has been standing there with a gun pointed at her for over 10 minutes, and she's clearly military." Kevin Jackson's TikTok video had exploded across social media. The hashtag #MillfieldPolice was trending in Georgia, with thousands of users sharing the video and demanding accountability. His follower count had jumped by 2,000 in the past 15 minutes. "Y'all, this is getting crazy," he said into his phone. "That Army lady still got a gun pointed at her, and now there's another cop here. This better get fixed quick." Captain Miller pulled Johnson aside. "Lisa, I've been trying to tell Morrison that the uniform and decorations look legitimate, but he won't listen. This woman has been completely compliant the entire time." Johnson nodded, pulling out her radio. "Dispatch, I need you to contact Fort Benning Security and verify the identity of a Colonel Denise Franklin, Deputy Commander of the Armor School." "Copy, Sergeant. Stand by." The request created immediate activity at Fort Benning. Master Sergeant David Brown, Colonel Franklin's aide, was in the base operations center when the call came through. "Sir," the duty officer informed him, "we have a civilian police request for identity verification on Colonel Franklin. They say she's involved in some kind of incident." Brown's expression darkened. Colonel Franklin had left the base 2 hours ago to handle personal business in town before returning for the evening briefing. She was expected back within 30 minutes. "What kind of incident?" Brown asked. "Police matter in Millfield, that's all they said." Brown immediately called Colonel Franklin's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. He then contacted the base commander, Colonel Robert Hayes. "Sir, we may have a situation involving Colonel Franklin in town. Local police are requesting identity verification." Colonel Hayes had been Franklin's mentor for over a decade. They had served together in Afghanistan, and he knew her character better than almost anyone in the military. "Get me everything you can about this police matter," Hayes ordered, "and prepare to mobilize if necessary." Back at the gas station, the social media storm was intensifying. Ashley Parker's Instagram live stream had drawn local news reporters' attention. Channel 9 News had dispatched a crew to the scene after receiving dozens of viewer tips about the confrontation. "This is absolutely unprecedented," Parker said into her phone. "A senior military officer being held at gunpoint by local police. The officer still hasn't lowered his weapon." The comments on her stream were increasingly urgent and outraged. "Someone needs to call the Pentagon. This is going to be national news in an hour. That cop's career is over. How is this legal?" Officer Morrison remained unmoved by the growing crowd and increasing documentation. His weapon stayed trained on Colonel Franklin, who maintained her military bearing despite the prolonged stress of the situation. "Ma'am," Sergeant Johnson addressed Colonel Franklin again, "do you have any identification with you?" "Yes, ma'am," Colonel Franklin replied. "My military ID is in my left chest pocket, along with my driver's license and vehicle registration." "Officer Morrison, I'm going to ask you to lower your weapon while the colonel retrieves her identification." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "Sergeant, with all due respect, I'm not comfortable with that. She could have anything in those pockets." The statement revealed the extent of Morrison's paranoia and prejudice. Colonel Franklin wore a dress blue uniform with minimal pockets, all clearly visible. There was no conceivable place she could hide a weapon, and her demeanor had been nothing but professional throughout the encounter. Johnson made a command decision. "Officer Morrison, lower your weapon immediately. That's an order." Morrison reluctantly complied, though he kept his hand near his service pistol. The tension in the air remained thick as Colonel Franklin slowly reached into her uniform pocket. She withdrew a leather ID holder containing her military identification card, Georgia driver's license, and vehicle registration. Johnson examined each document carefully while the crowd of civilians continued recording. The military ID was clearly legitimate, featuring Colonel Franklin's photograph, rank, and unit assignment. The driver's license matched perfectly, and the vehicle registration confirmed her ownership of the Mercedes. "Everything appears to be in order," Johnson announced loud enough for the cameras to hear. Morrison wasn't satisfied. "Those documents could be forged. You can get anything online these days." Johnson's radio crackled with a response from dispatch. "Sergeant Johnson, Fort Benning Security confirms Colonel Denise Franklin is currently assigned as Deputy Commander of the Armor School. They're requesting immediate contact regarding her status." The confirmation hit the scene like a thunderbolt. Even Morrison seemed to realize the magnitude of what had just transpired. He had held a senior military officer at gunpoint for over 15 minutes based on nothing more than his personal suspicions and biases. Sandra Davis captured the moment perfectly on her live stream. "Did y'all just hear that? The military base just confirmed she's exactly who she says she is. That officer just held a colonel at gunpoint for nothing." Her viewer count had climbed past 600, and the video was being shared across multiple platforms. Local news outlets were starting to pick up the story from social media feeds. Kevin Jackson was ecstatic on his TikTok stream. "They just confirmed it. She's a real colonel. That cop is in so much trouble right now." The comments on his video were celebratory and angry simultaneously. "Justice for the colonel. Fire that cop immediately. This is why we need police reform. Respect our military." Colonel Franklin finally allowed herself a small smile. "Sergeant Johnson, now that my identity has been confirmed, might I ask what traffic violation prompted this stop?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Johnson looked at Morrison, waiting for an explanation that everyone knew wouldn't come. "I observed suspicious activity," Morrison said weakly. "What specifically?" Johnson pressed. Subject was looking around nervously, checking her phone repeatedly, acting in a manner consistent with criminal surveillance. The explanation was so thin it was almost transparent. Colonel Franklin had been checking GPS directions and responding to text messages from her staff, the same activities millions of Americans performed every day without being held at gunpoint. "Officer Morrison," Colonel Franklin said, her tone still professional, but with an edge of authority that hadn't been present before. "I was checking directions to return to Fort Benning for my evening briefing. I was also responding to messages from my staff regarding tomorrow's training exercises." Johnson pulled Morrison aside for a private conversation while Colonel Franklin remained by her vehicle, finally allowing her hands to rest at her sides. "Kyle, what the hell were you thinking?" Johnson whispered harshly. "You held a full colonel at gunpoint over checking her phone?" "Something didn't feel right," Morrison insisted. "She didn't look like she belonged here." The racial subtext was finally explicit. Morrison had profiled Colonel Franklin based on her race and his assumptions about who belonged in an affluent suburban area. "Kyle, you've created a massive problem. This is going to be investigated by internal affairs. Probably by the state, maybe by the federal government. Military officers are protected by specific statutes." Morrison's face went pale as the implications began to sink in. "I was just doing my job." "No, you were doing something else entirely," Johnson replied grimly. Ashley Parker's Instagram live stream had caught fragments of the conversation between Johnson and Morrison. Her viewers were analyzing every word and gesture. "Looks like the supervisor is not happy with the officer who drew his gun," she reported to her audience. "This could get really serious for him." The Channel 9 news van pulled into the parking lot, followed immediately by a car from the Columbus Ledger-Inquirer newspaper. The local media had arrived, transforming the incident from a social media phenomenon into a developing news story. Reporter Diana Foster approached Sergeant Johnson with her camera crew. "Sergeant, can you comment on the police action here involving a military officer?" Johnson held up her hand. "No comment at this time. This is an ongoing investigation." But Colonel Franklin stepped forward. "I'm Colonel Denise Franklin, U.S. Army. I'd be happy to provide a statement." The decision to speak to the media was strategic. Colonel Franklin understood that controlling the narrative early would be crucial for ensuring accountability and preventing the incident from being minimized or covered up. "Colonel, can you tell us what happened here today?" Foster asked. "I was getting gas on my way back to Fort Benning when Officer Morrison initiated a traffic stop. Despite providing full identification and maintaining complete compliance, I was held at gunpoint for over 15 minutes while he questioned my identity and military service." The statement was measured but damning. Foster followed up immediately. "Were you given any explanation for the initial stop?" Officer Morrison claimed I was acting suspiciously by checking my phone, which I was using for GPS navigation and military communications. The interview was being broadcast live on Channel 9's Facebook page, where it was rapidly gaining viewers and shares. The local story was beginning to attract regional and potentially national attention. Master Sergeant Brown arrived at the scene in an official Army vehicle just as Colonel Franklin was concluding her media interview. His presence added another layer of gravity to the situation. "Colonel Franklin," Brown said, saluting properly despite the informal setting. "Colonel Hayes sent me to provide any assistance needed." The salute was returned crisply, and the military bearing of both soldiers was obvious to everyone present. Officer Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable as the full weight of his actions became apparent. "Thank you, Sergeant Brown," Colonel Franklin replied. "I believe the immediate situation has been resolved, but there will undoubtedly be follow-up required." Brown surveyed the scene, taking note of the media presence, the civilian witnesses still recording, and the obvious tension among the police officers. "Ma'am, Colonel Hayes requests your immediate return to the base for debriefing. This incident will need to be reported through proper channels." The mention of proper channels sent a chill through the assembled police officers. Military-civilian incidents involving potential civil rights violations were serious matters that could escalate quickly through multiple governmental agencies. Sergeant Johnson approached Colonel Franklin with genuine remorse evident in her expression. "Colonel, on behalf of the Millfield Police Department, I want to apologize for this incident. This should never have happened." "Sergeant Johnson, I appreciate your professionalism in resolving the immediate situation," Colonel Franklin replied. "However, I'm sure you understand that this matter will require formal investigation and resolution." The promise of investigation hung over the scene like a storm cloud. Officer Morrison stood silently, finally understanding that his actions had consequences far beyond a simple traffic stop. As Colonel Franklin prepared to leave with Master Sergeant Brown, the social media documentation continued. The incident had been recorded from multiple angles by numerous witnesses, creating an irrefutable record of events that would soon be analyzed by investigators, lawyers, and the court of public opinion. The afternoon sun was setting over Millfield as the participants began to disperse, but the repercussions of the encounter were just beginning. Within hours, the story would reach military leadership, police administrators, civil rights organizations, and news outlets across the country. Officer Kyle Morrison's 12-year career was about to face its greatest challenge, while Colonel Denise Franklin prepared to navigate the complex intersection of military service, civil rights, and media attention. The documentation phase was complete. Now the real work would begin. The Millfield Police Department headquarters buzzed with unusual activity at 6:30 a.m. the following morning. Chief Rebecca Hayes had arrived 2 hours early, her coffee growing cold as she reviewed incident reports, social media feeds, and voicemail messages from reporters across 3 states. The overnight social media explosion had been catastrophic for the department's reputation. Sandra Davis's Facebook live stream had been viewed over 50,000 times and shared across hundreds of community groups throughout Georgia and Alabama. Kevin Jackson's TikTok video had gone viral with over 200,000 views and 15,000 shares. Ashley Parker's Instagram live stream had been picked up by national news aggregators. But the social media storm was only the beginning. Chief Hayes's voicemail contained messages from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the FBI Civil Rights Division, the Department of Defense Inspector General, and representatives from Fort Benning's command structure. "This is a complete disaster," Chief Hayes muttered to herself as she scrolled through the messages. Her phone rang immediately. "Chief Hayes, this is Colonel Robert Hayes at Fort Benning." No relation despite the shared surname, but the military commander's tone carried unmistakable authority. "We need to discuss the incident involving my deputy commander yesterday." "Colonel Hayes, I want to assure you that we're taking this matter very seriously," Chief Hayes replied, though she knew her assurances would carry little weight given the video evidence circulating online. "Chief, I've reviewed the social media documentation of this incident. One of my senior officers was held at gunpoint for over 15 minutes without justification. This is unacceptable." The conversation was professional but tense. Colonel Hayes outlined the military's concerns while Chief Hayes promised a thorough investigation. Both leaders understood that their handling of the next few days would determine the long-term consequences for their respective organizations. Officer Kyle Morrison sat in the Internal Affairs interview room at 8 a.m., facing Detective Captain Sarah Davis and Lieutenant Robert Thompson. Morrison had requested union representation, and Attorney Mark Stevens sat beside him, reviewing the incident reports. "Officer Morrison," Captain Davis began, "let's start with why you initiated the traffic stop on Colonel Franklin yesterday." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I observed suspicious activity. Subject was in an expensive vehicle, looking around nervously, repeatedly checking her phone." "Did Colonel Franklin commit any traffic violations?" Lieutenant Thompson asked. "Not specifically, but her behavior was consistent with criminal surveillance patterns." Detective Davis pulled out her tablet and began playing Sandra Davis's Facebook live stream. The video showed Colonel Franklin standing calmly beside her vehicle, hands visible, exhibiting perfect military bearing while Morrison kept his weapon trained on her. "Officer Morrison, can you point out the suspicious behavior in this video?" Morrison watched himself on screen, seeing for the first time how the encounter appeared to objective observers. The woman in the video was clearly professional, compliant, and unthreatening. His continued insistence on keeping his weapon drawn looked increasingly unreasonable. "She was acting suspicious before the recording started," Morrison insisted weakly. "How specifically?" Captain Davis pressed. Morrison struggled to articulate his suspicions without revealing their obvious racial basis. She didn't look like she belonged in that neighborhood." The statement hung in the air like an admission of guilt. Lieutenant Thompson made detailed notes while Captain Davis continued the questioning. "Officer Morrison, when Colonel Franklin showed you her military identification, why didn't you accept it as legitimate? Anyone can buy military gear online. Stolen valor is a real crime. But when Sergeant Johnson verified her identity through Fort Benning, you still seemed reluctant to release her. Why?" Morrison's attorney intervened. "My client was exercising appropriate caution given the circumstances." Captain Davis wasn't satisfied. "What circumstances required holding a verified military officer at gunpoint for 15 minutes? The question had no good answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Meanwhile, at Fort Benning, Colonel Franklin was briefing her chain of command on the incident. The conference room contained Colonel Hayes, the base commander, along with representatives from the Staff Judge Advocate's Office and Public Affairs. "Colonel Franklin," Colonel Hayes began, "walk us through yesterday's events from your perspective." Colonel Franklin provided a precise chronological account of the incident from the initial traffic stop through her eventual release. Her military training had conditioned her to provide factual, unemotional reports, even under stress. At no point did Officer Morrison provide a legitimate reason for the traffic stop, she concluded. His behavior appeared to be based entirely on assumptions about my race and perceived social status. Major Lisa Parker from the Staff Judge Advocate's Office took extensive notes. "Colonel, are you willing to pursue formal complaints through civilian and military channels?" "Major Parker, I believe accountability is essential not just for this incident, but for preventing similar treatment of other military personnel and civilians." The meeting continued for over an hour, with Colonel Franklin authorizing the base legal team to coordinate with civilian authorities and civil rights organizations. The military took care of its own, and an attack on a senior officer was an attack on the institution itself. By noon, the story had reached national media outlets. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and major newspapers were covering the incident, using the social media videos as primary source material. The hashtag #MillfieldPolice was trending nationally, accompanied by "Die Justice for Colonel Franklin" and "Respect Our Military." Talk radio stations across the South were covering the story extensively. Conservative hosts were outraged that a military officer had been disrespected by local police. Liberal hosts focused on the obvious racial profiling. Both sides agreed that Officer Morrison's actions were indefensible. At the Millfield City Council chambers, Mayor Robert Stone convened an emergency meeting with Chief Hayes and the city attorney. The mayor had been fielding calls from constituents, reporters, and state officials since early morning. "Chief Hayes, I need to understand how one of our officers created a national incident," Mayor Stone said, his frustration evident. "Mr. Mayor, Officer Morrison made serious errors in judgment. We're conducting a full investigation and will take appropriate action." "What kind of action are we talking about?" Chief Hayes consulted her notes. "Suspension pending investigation, mandatory retraining, possible termination depending on the findings." The city attorney, Jennifer Brooks, reviewed the legal exposure. "We're facing potential federal civil rights violations, military liaison issues, and significant civil liability. The social media documentation makes this case virtually indefensible." Mayor Stone understood the political implications immediately. Millfield was a small suburban community that prided itself on good relationships with nearby military installations. The economic impact of military personnel and their families was substantial, and anything that damaged those relationships would hurt the city's interests. "I want immediate action on this," the mayor ordered. "Whatever it takes to make this right." The afternoon brought additional complications. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund announced they were monitoring the situation and considering formal action. The American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement condemning the racial profiling incident. The Military Officers Association of America called for swift accountability. But the most significant development came from Washington. The Department of Defense Inspector General's office announced they were opening a formal investigation into potential violations of military personnel rights by civilian authorities. Detective Captain Davis concluded Officer Morrison's internal affairs interview at 4:00 p.m. The session had lasted 6 hours and covered every aspect of the incident in exhaustive detail. "Officer Morrison, based on your statement and the available evidence, you will be suspended without pay pending completion of this investigation," Captain Davis announced. Morrison's face went pale. "Captain, I was just doing my job. I made a judgment call based on suspicious behavior. Officer Morrison holding a military officer at gunpoint for 15 minutes because she was checking her phone in an expensive car is not appropriate police work. It's racial profiling." The explicit acknowledgement of racial profiling marked a significant moment in the investigation. The department was no longer treating this as a simple mistake in judgment, but as a potential civil rights violation. Morrison's attorney requested time to review the evidence and prepare a response, but the damage was already extensive. The social media documentation provided an irrefutable record of Morrison's actions and statements. That evening, Channel 9 News aired a comprehensive report on the incident, including interviews with Colonel Franklin, civilian witnesses, and local civil rights leaders. The story was picked up by national networks and became the lead story on several major news programs. Colonel Franklin's measured, professional responses to media questions contrasted sharply with Officer Morrison's aggressive behavior in the videos. The optics were devastating for both Morrison personally and the Millfield Police Department institutionally. Social media analysis showed the story continuing to gain momentum. Twitter engagement was approaching 1 million interactions under various hashtags. Facebook shares exceeded 100,000. TikTok videos related to the incident had accumulated over 5 million views collectively. But beyond the social media metrics, the incident was generating substantive policy discussions. Police accountability advocates used the case to highlight the need for bias training and procedural reforms. Military advocacy groups called for stronger protections for service members in civilian encounters. The Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council announced they would review the incident for potential certification violations. If Morrison was found to have violated professional standards, he could lose his police certification permanently, ending any possibility of law enforcement employment in Georgia. At Fort Benning, Colonel Franklin worked late into the evening, coordinating with base leadership on the military's response to the incident. The Army's Public Affairs Office was crafting statements that would support Colonel Franklin while maintaining appropriate relationships with civilian law enforcement. "Ma'am," Master Sergeant Brown reported, "we've received over 200 messages of support from military personnel across all branches of service. This incident has resonated throughout the military community." Colonel Franklin reviewed some of the messages. Fellow officers shared their own experiences with civilian police encounters, many describing similar situations where their military service had been questioned or dismissed based on racial assumptions. "This is bigger than one incident," Colonel Franklin told her staff. "This is about how military personnel are perceived and treated in civilian communities. We have an opportunity to address systemic issues." The recognition that the incident represented broader problems would shape the military's long-term response and Colonel Franklin's personal approach to seeking accountability. As the first day of national attention concluded, all parties began preparing for what would be an extended period of investigation, media scrutiny, and institutional soul-searching. Officer Morrison's career hung in the balance, while Colonel Franklin prepared to become an unwilling symbol of military-civilian relations and racial justice. The documentation phase had captured irrefutable evidence of the incident. The investigation phase was revealing the systematic failures that had made such an encounter possible. Now the consequences phase would determine whether meaningful change would emerge from the crisis. The third day after the incident brought a development that no one had anticipated. Officer Kyle Morrison arrived at the Millfield Police Department to clean out his desk, having been formally terminated following the completion of the internal affairs investigation. But instead of quietly accepting his dismissal, Morrison had decided to fight back through the media. Channel 9 News had arranged an exclusive interview with Morrison, broadcast live at 6 p.m. Reporter Diana Foster sat across from the former officer in the station's studio, preparing to give Morrison his first opportunity to publicly defend his actions. "Officer Morrison, thank you for joining us tonight," Foster began. "You've been terminated from the Millfield Police Department following the incident with Colonel Franklin. What's your response to that decision?" Morrison appeared tense but defiant as he faced the camera. "Diana, I want to be clear about something. I've served this community faithfully for 12 years. I've never had a complaint about racial bias, never been disciplined for excessive force. What happened that day was a police officer doing his job based on suspicious behavior, nothing more." Foster leaned forward. "Officer Morrison, the video shows Colonel Franklin standing calmly beside her vehicle for over 15 minutes while you kept your weapon drawn. What specifically made her behavior suspicious enough to warrant that level of force?" "Look, I've been trained to recognize patterns of criminal behavior. When someone is casing a location for potential criminal activity, they exhibit certain tells, looking around nervously, checking their phone repeatedly, appearing out of place for the neighborhood." The answer revealed Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation and his inability to acknowledge his racial bias even after being terminated for it. Colonel Franklin nodded grimly. "Major, the truth is documented. Let him dig his own grave deeper." Back in the television studio, Foster continued her questioning. "Officer Morrison, multiple witnesses recorded the incident. In those videos, Colonel Franklin appears calm and compliant throughout the encounter. What suspicious behavior specifically concerned you?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. She was looking around nervously, checking her phone repeatedly. In my experience, that's consistent with someone casing a location for criminal activity. But wasn't she simply checking GPS directions to return to Fort Benning? That's what she claimed afterward. But at the time, I had no way of knowing her intentions. Foster pulled up the Facebook live stream on the studio monitors. Officer Morrison, let's watch this footage together. Can you point out the nervous or suspicious behavior you observed? The video played, showing Colonel Franklin standing with perfect military bearing, hands visible, complying with every instruction, while Morrison kept his weapon trained on her. Her demeanor was professional and calm throughout the 15-minute ordeal. Morrison watched the footage with growing discomfort. You have to understand, the camera doesn't show what happened before the recording started. What happened before the recording started? Morrison struggled to provide specifics. She was acting suspiciously, looking around, checking her phone multiple times. The repetitive, vague answers weren't helping Morrison's case. Social media comments on the live stream were overwhelmingly critical of his performance. This guy's making it worse for himself. He can't explain what she did wrong because she didn't do anything wrong. 12 years as a cop, and this is his judgment. At the Millfield Police Department, Chief Hayes watched the interview with growing alarm. Morrison was creating additional legal exposure for the department with every answer. Turn it off, she told her staff. He's making this worse for everyone. But the interview continued, with Foster pressing Morrison on the racial dynamics of the incident. Officer Morrison, Colonel Franklin is a black woman driving an expensive car in a predominantly white suburb. Did race play a factor in your decision to stop her? Morrison's face flushed. Absolutely not. I don't see color. I see suspicious behavior. This whole thing has been blown out of proportion by people trying to make it about race when it's about public safety. The denial rang hollow to viewers who had seen the video evidence. The claim that he didn't see color was particularly galling given his statements about Colonel Franklin not looking like she belonged in the neighborhood. Foster wasn't finished. Officer Morrison, when Colonel Franklin showed you her military identification and platinum frequent flyer card, why didn't you accept them as legitimate? Anyone can buy military gear online. Stolen valor is a serious problem, and I've seen it before. But when Sergeant Johnson verified her identity through Fort Benning, you still seemed reluctant to release her. Why? Morrison paused, realizing he was trapped by his own previous statements. I was being thorough. Better safe than sorry. The interview was becoming a disaster for Morrison. Each answer revealed the weakness of his position and the racial assumptions underlying his actions. Meanwhile, at Fort Benning, Colonel Franklin received a call from Pentagon officials. The incident had reached the highest levels of military leadership, and the Department of Defense was coordinating with the Department of Justice on a potential federal civil rights investigation. Colonel Franklin, General Patricia Davis said from her Pentagon office, this incident has highlighted broader issues about the treatment of military personnel by civilian authorities. We want to ensure this becomes a catalyst for positive change, not just punishment for one officer. Colonel Franklin appreciated the military's support, but she also understood the complexity of the situation. General Davis, I want accountability, but I also want to ensure that other military families don't experience what I went through. The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with General Davis outlining the military's plans for improving coordination with civilian law enforcement agencies. The incident would be used as a case study in military-civilian relations training programs. Back at the television station, Morrison's interview was reaching its conclusion. Foster asked one final question that would define his legacy. Officer Morrison, if you could do this encounter over again, what would you do differently? Morrison considered the question for a long moment. His answer would either show growth and accountability or confirm the biases that had created the crisis. Diana, I would probably be more patient in explaining my concerns to the subject, but I still believe I acted appropriately given the information I had at the time. The non-apology answer was the final nail in Morrison's credibility coffin. He had been given an opportunity to express remorse, acknowledge mistakes, or show personal growth, and he had chosen to double down on his original position. Social media reaction was swift and brutal. The hashtag Jock Morrison interview began trending within minutes, accompanied by overwhelmingly negative commentary. He learned nothing from this experience. No remorse, no accountability, no growth. This is exactly why he needed to be fired. The interview had accomplished the opposite of Morrison's intentions. Instead of rehabilitating his reputation, it had confirmed the worst assumptions about his character and judgment. At the Millfield City Council chambers, Mayor Stone convened another emergency meeting. The Morrison interview had created new complications for the city's liability exposure and public relations challenges. "Chief Hayes, did you know Morrison was going to do this interview?" Mayor Stone asked. "No, sir. We advised him through his attorney not to make public statements, but he's no longer our employee." City Attorney Brooks reviewed the legal implications. "Morrison's statements tonight could be used against us in civil litigation. He's essentially admitted to racial profiling while claiming it was justified." The city's insurance carrier had already reserved funds for a potential settlement with Colonel Franklin. Morrison's media appearance had likely increased both the settlement amount and the city's reputational damage. But the most significant consequence came the following morning. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced they were opening a criminal investigation into potential civil rights violations by Morrison. The interview had provided prosecutors with additional evidence of racial bias and lack of remorse. FBI Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, assigned to the Civil Rights Division, reviewed Morrison's television statements with her team. The interview had handed federal investigators additional ammunition for potential charges. "He's essentially confessed to racial profiling on live television," Agent Rodriguez observed. "This makes our case significantly stronger." Colonel Franklin learned about the federal investigation through official channels. The FBI had contacted Fort Benning to schedule interviews with her and other military witnesses. The incident was now a federal case with potential criminal implications. "Ma'am," Master Sergeant Brown reported, "the FBI wants to interview you next week about the incident. They're treating this as a potential civil rights violation." Colonel Franklin nodded, understanding the gravity of federal involvement. "Sergeant Brown, make sure they have access to all of our documentation and any additional evidence we've collected." The military's cooperation with federal investigators sent a clear message about the seriousness of attacks on military personnel. The Army was committed to ensuring accountability and preventing similar incidents. Meanwhile, Morrison's personal consequences continued to escalate. The Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council voted unanimously to revoke his police certification, making him unemployable in law enforcement throughout the state. His application for unemployment benefits was denied because he had been terminated for cause. His pension benefits were under review pending the outcome of criminal investigations. His family was receiving threatening messages through social media. Morrison's wife, Jennifer, had watched her husband's television interview with growing horror. 12 years of marriage had shown her his flaws, but she had never fully understood the extent of his racial biases. "Kyle, what were you thinking with that interview?" she asked him that night. "You made everything worse." Morrison remained defiant. "I told the truth. I did my job and now I'm being sacrificed for political correctness." "Kyle, you held a woman at gunpoint because she was checking her phone. How is that doing your job?" The argument that followed would contribute to Jennifer Morrison filing for divorce within the month. The incident had destroyed not just Morrison's career, but his personal relationships as well. At Fort Benning, Colonel Franklin was preparing for her FBI interview when she received an unexpected visitor. Sandra Davis, the civilian who had recorded the incident on Facebook, asked to meet with her. "Colonel Franklin, I wanted to thank you for how you handled that situation," Sandra said. "Your dignity and professionalism inspired a lot of people." Colonel Franklin was touched by the gesture. "Mrs. Davis, your decision to document the incident was crucial for ensuring accountability. Thank you for having the courage to record what was happening." The meeting between Colonel Franklin and Sandra Davis symbolized the positive community response to the incident. Citizens were stepping forward to support the military officer and condemn the discriminatory treatment she had received. Local business owners in Millfield began displaying signs supporting military personnel and condemning discrimination. The city's relationship with Fort Benning was being actively repaired through community outreach and policy changes. But Morrison's supporters also began organizing. A small group of residents created a Facebook group called Support Officer Morrison, claiming he was being unfairly persecuted for doing his job. The group attracted several hundred members, mostly from outside Millfield. The online support for Morrison revealed the persistence of racial bias in segments of the community. Comments in the support group often contained explicitly racist language and conspiracy theories about the incident. Law enforcement officers from other agencies were divided in their response. Professional organizations generally condemned Morrison's actions as violating basic police standards, while some individual officers defended him privately. The Police Benevolent Association initially remained neutral, but after reviewing the video evidence and Morrison's television interview, they issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions. The PBA supports professional law enforcement, but we cannot defend actions that violate constitutional rights and professional standards, the statement read. The abandonment by his fellow officers was perhaps the most devastating consequence for Morrison. Law enforcement had been his identity for 12 years, and now the profession was rejecting him. As the fourth week after the incident concluded, the consequences had spread far beyond the original participants. Morrison faced criminal charges, civil lawsuits, professional sanctions, and personal bankruptcy. His family was dissolving, his career was ended, and his reputation was destroyed. Colonel Franklin had become a national symbol of dignity under pressure and military professionalism. Speaking requests poured in from universities, professional organizations, and civil rights groups. She was being promoted to brigadier general and assigned to the Pentagon to work on military-civilian relations. The city of Millfield faced federal oversight, insurance claims, and a damaged reputation that would take years to repair. The police department was implementing comprehensive reforms under court supervision. But the most significant consequences were systematic. Police departments across Georgia were revising their policies on traffic stops and bias training. Military installations were improving coordination with local law enforcement. Federal agencies were developing stronger protections for military personnel in civilian encounters. The incident had catalyzed changes that would benefit thousands of service members and civilians for years to come. One afternoon at a gas station had exposed institutional failures and created momentum for meaningful reform. Officer Morrison's decision to point his weapon at Colonel Franklin had cost him everything. But it had also created an opportunity for progress that leaders on all sides were determined not to waste. The consequences phase was complete, but the transformation it had initiated was just beginning. 6 months after the incident at the Millfield gas station, Colonel Franklin stood at the podium of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., preparing to deliver remarks at the launch of the Military-Civilian Relations Task Force. The audience included Pentagon officials, police chiefs from major cities, civil rights leaders, and congressional representatives. The transformation in her own life had been dramatic. The day after Morrison's termination, she had received a call from General Patricia Davis at the Pentagon, offering her a promotion to brigadier general and a position developing policies for military-civilian interactions. "General Franklin," the moderator introduced her, "you've become a symbol of dignity under pressure and professional excellence. How has this experience changed your perspective on military-civilian relations?" Franklin approached the microphone, her general stars catching the television lights. The same poise that had served her during Morrison's weapon-drawn confrontation now commanded attention from a national audience. "Thank you for having me today," she began. 6 months ago, I was held at gunpoint by a police officer who decided I didn't belong in a particular neighborhood. Today, we're announcing initiatives that will prevent other military families from experiencing similar discrimination. The task force represented unprecedented cooperation between the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, and major law enforcement organizations. The incident with Morrison had provided the catalyst for systematic reforms that advocates had been seeking for years. General Franklin clicked to her first slide, showing statistics on military-civilian encounters compiled over the past 6 months. Since the Millfield incident, we've documented over 200 similar cases of military personnel experiencing discriminatory treatment by civilian law enforcement. These incidents were happening regularly, but they weren't being systematically tracked or addressed. The audience included chiefs of police from Atlanta, Birmingham, Jacksonville, and other major southern cities. They had initially resisted federal oversight of their departments, but the public attention generated by the Morrison case had made cooperation politically necessary. The Military-Civilian Relations Task Force will implement 3 major initiatives, General Franklin continued. First, mandatory bias training for all law enforcement agencies that receive federal funding. Second, a joint reporting system for incidents involving military personnel. Third, regular coordination meetings between military installations and local police departments. Police Chief Robert Davis from Atlanta had been skeptical of the federal involvement initially, but his perspective had changed after reviewing the documented cases of military personnel being profiled or harassed. General Franklin, Chief Davis said during the Q&A session, our department has already seen improvements from the preliminary training programs. Officers are more aware of military identification and protocols. We've had 0 incidents since implementing the changes. The acknowledgement from a major police chief represented significant progress. Law enforcement leaders were publicly endorsing reforms they had privately resisted for years. But General Franklin wasn't finished with her presentation. She clicked to a slide showing Kyle Morrison's photograph from his police personnel file. Officer Kyle Morrison was terminated, criminally charged, and lost his police certification. However, punishment of individuals isn't sufficient if the systems that enabled his actions remain unchanged. The reference to Morrison generated murmurs throughout the audience. His case had become a cautionary tale throughout law enforcement, but Franklin was using it to emphasize broader reform needs. Morrison's actions were enabled by inadequate training, weak supervision, and departmental cultures that tolerated racial bias. Addressing those systematic failures prevents future incidents more effectively than punishing individuals after damage is done. In Millfield, the city was still recovering from the reputational and financial consequences of Morrison's actions. The federal civil rights lawsuit filed by General Franklin's attorneys had been settled for $2.3 million, the largest civil rights settlement in the city's history. Mayor Stone had survived a recall election by promising comprehensive police reforms and improved community relations. Chief Hayes had resigned under pressure and been replaced by an African-American chief from outside the department. The new police chief, Patricia Johnson, formerly of the Richmond Police Department, had implemented sweeping changes in training, supervision, and accountability. The department's culture was slowly transforming, though progress was uneven. We've terminated 3 additional officers for bias-related violations since I arrived, Chief Johnson reported to the City Council. We're changing a culture that tolerated discriminatory behavior for too long. The Millfield Police Department was now operating under federal oversight through a consent decree negotiated with the Department of Justice. Every aspect of their operations was being monitored and reformed, from recruitment to training to discipline. At Fort Benning, the incident had led to the creation of a military-civilian liaison office dedicated to preventing and resolving conflicts between military personnel and local law enforcement. Master Sergeant David Brown had been assigned to head the office. We've handled over 150 cases in the past 6 months, Brown reported to base leadership. Most are resolved through communication and education rather than formal complaints. The early intervention approach is working. The success at Fort Benning had led to similar programs being established at military installations across the country. The Department of Defense was making military-civilian relations a priority for the first time in decades, but the transformation extended beyond official policy changes. The incident had sparked conversations in military families, police departments, and civilian communities about race, bias, and professional responsibility. At the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, Morrison's case had become a central example in bias training curricula. New police officers watched the gas station videos and analyzed the decision-making failures that had led to his termination. This case demonstrates how personal bias can destroy careers and harm communities, instructors told police academy classes. Officer Morrison's assumptions about who belonged in certain neighborhoods led him to make decisions that violated constitutional rights and professional standards. Morrison himself had become a cautionary tale, but he had also found unexpected opportunities for redemption. After his criminal case was resolved with a plea agreement to community service, he had begun speaking at police training sessions about the consequences of bias. "I lost everything because I made assumptions about people based on their race," Morrison told a class of police recruits in Columbus. "I thought I was being a good cop, but I was actually violating the rights of citizens I was sworn to protect." The appearances were part of Morrison's court-ordered community service, but they had evolved into something more meaningful. His first-hand account of how bias had destroyed his life and career resonated with officers in training. Morrison's marriage had ended in divorce, as Jennifer had feared, but the forced self-reflection that followed his termination had led to genuine personal growth. He was attending counseling, participating in racial reconciliation programs, and working at a construction company. "I can't undo what I did to Colonel Franklin," Morrison said in a recent interview with the Southern Poverty Law Center, "but I can try to prevent other officers from making the same mistakes." The transformation wasn't complete or universal. Morrison still received support from some segments of the community who viewed him as a victim of political correctness. Online forums continued to defend his actions and attack General Franklin. But the mainstream law enforcement community had largely rejected Morrison's approach. Professional organizations used his case to demonstrate the importance of constitutional policing and bias-free decision-making. General Franklin had used her national platform to address broader issues beyond her personal experience. She had testified before Congress about military-civilian relations, spoken at police chiefs' conferences, and written articles for law enforcement journals. "This incident could have ended my military career or damaged my family," she told a Senate Judiciary Committee. "Instead, it became an opportunity to address systematic problems that affect thousands of military families." That transformation was only possible because of the accountability demanded by the public and implemented by government leaders. The congressional testimony had led to legislation requiring federal agencies to coordinate on military-civilian relations issues. The bill passed with bipartisan support, demonstrating how the Morrison incident had created political momentum for reform. But General Franklin was most proud of the grassroots changes the incident had inspired. Military spouses were organizing community education programs. Veterans groups were training members on their rights during police encounters. Civil rights organizations were documenting and addressing discriminatory treatment of military families. Sandra Davis, the civilian who had recorded the original incident, had become a community activist focused on police accountability. Her Facebook page, which had gained 50,000 followers after the video went viral, regularly highlighted positive police community interactions alongside calls for reform. "That day at the gas station changed my life too," Sandra said at a community meeting in Millfield. "I realized that recording injustice isn't enough. You have to follow through with action to create change." Kevin Jackson, the college student whose TikTok video had helped the incident go viral, had changed his major to criminal justice and was planning to attend law school. The experience had inspired him to pursue a career in civil rights law. "Seeing how one video could lead to so much change made me realize the power of documentation and legal advocacy," Jackson said. "I want to help other people who experience discrimination get the justice they deserve." Ashley Parker had used her paralegal experience to help General Franklin's legal team document the case. She had since started law school with plans to specialize in civil rights litigation. The civilian witnesses had been transformed by their involvement in the incident, choosing to dedicate their careers to preventing similar injustices. At the one-year anniversary of the incident, General Franklin returned to Millfield for the dedication of a new community center focused on military-civilian relations. The building was located 2 blocks from the gas station where Morrison had held her at gunpoint. "This community center represents transformation," General Franklin told the gathered crowd. "A year ago, this city was divided by an incident that exposed our failures. Today, we're united around our commitment to justice and equality." The audience included current and former military personnel, police officers, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by the incident to become more engaged in civic life. Mayor Stone, who had survived the political fallout from Morrison's actions, spoke about the city's transformation. "We failed General Franklin that day at the gas station," Stone said. "But we've worked every day since then to ensure we never fail another military family or any citizen in that way again." The community center would provide training for police officers, education for military families, and resources for anyone experiencing discrimination. It represented the constructive response to a destructive incident. Chief Johnson announced that the Millfield Police Department had received national accreditation for its reformed policies and procedures. The department that had terminated Morrison was now being recognized as a model for constitutional policing. "General Franklin's dignity during that terrible encounter inspired us to become better," Chief Johnson said. "Her example showed us what professionalism looks like under pressure." The ceremony concluded with General Franklin unveiling a plaque commemorating the incident and the changes it had inspired. This plaque honors not just the resolution of one incident, but the ongoing commitment to justice and equality in our communities, she read. "May this serve as a reminder that discrimination has no place in America and that accountability leads to transformation." As the crowd dispersed, General Franklin reflected on the journey from that afternoon at the gas station to this moment of community celebration. Morrison's decision to point his weapon at her had cost him everything, but it had also created opportunities for progress that were still unfolding. The incident had demonstrated the power of documentation, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of transformation. One person's bias had created a crisis, but the response to that crisis had made the system stronger and more just. General Franklin's phone buzzed with a text message from another military officer who had experienced discriminatory treatment in a different state. The message included video documentation and a request for advice on seeking accountability. The work was far from over, but the framework for addressing these incidents was now in place. The Military-Civilian Relations Task Force, the training programs, the reporting systems, and the accountability mechanisms would help other military families avoid the experience she had endured. As General Franklin drove away from Millfield, she passed the Shell station where Morrison had held her at gunpoint. The location looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. The transformation was complete, but the vigilance required to maintain it would be eternal. Progress was possible, but it required constant effort from people committed to justice and equality. Morrison's weapon had been aimed at one person, but the response to his actions had protected thousands of others. That was the true measure of transformation, the legacy that would outlast any individual incident or career. The story that began with discrimination had become a testament to the power of accountability and the possibility of change. From a gas station confrontation to a national movement, the incident had proven that America could still live up to its highest ideals when citizens demanded nothing less. The transformation was complete, and the future was more just because of it. General Denise Franklin stood before a graduating class of police officers at the Georgia Public Safety Training Center. The same facility that had once trained Kyle Morrison now used her story as a centerpiece of their reformed curriculum on constitutional policing and community relations. 2 years ago, she began, I was held at gunpoint by an officer who saw my race before he saw my service. Today, each of you is better prepared to see the person before you make assumptions. That progress represents hope. In the audience sat police recruits from diverse backgrounds, many of whom had been inspired to join law enforcement specifically to be agents of positive change after witnessing the national conversation that followed the Millfield incident. The transformation had rippled far beyond anyone's original expectations. The Military-Civilian Relations Task Force had become a permanent federal program. Police departments across the nation had revised their training protocols. Military installations had established liaison programs with local law enforcement. But perhaps most significantly, the incident had changed how individual officers approached their daily interactions with citizens. The Morrison effect, as it became known in police training circles, served as a constant reminder that split-second judgments based on bias could destroy careers and harm communities. Kyle Morrison had completed his community service and found stability working construction in a small Georgia town. His appearances at police training sessions had evolved from court-ordered obligation to voluntary advocacy. He would never be a police officer again, but he had found a different way to serve his community by helping others avoid his mistakes. I was wrong, he told each new class of recruits. I let my personal biases override my professional training and my sworn duty to protect and serve all citizens equally. Don't let pride and prejudice cost you everything like it cost me. The gas station on Maple Street had become an unlikely pilgrimage site for those studying civil rights history. A small memorial plaque marked the location where dignity had triumphed over discrimination, where accountability had led to transformation, and where one woman's courage under pressure had changed thousands of lives for the better. General Franklin continued her work at the Pentagon, now overseeing a department dedicated to military-civilian relations. Her office walls displayed her military commendations alongside letters from police officers, military families, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her example. The incident that began with one officer's weapon pointed at one soldier had ended with a nation pointing toward justice. That was the true measure of transformation, not just punishment for wrongdoing, but progress toward a more perfect union where all citizens, regardless of race or background, could expect equal protection under the law. The story was complete, but its impact would endure for generations to come.